Hello, everyone. Again, it's Professor Cruz, and welcome to week 4 of our 6-week summer ethics class. As you can see, the time is moving pretty quickly. And in particular, this week is a very big week for us. We kind of have the most concentrated amount of work this week than we have in any other week, which is why we're not really doing a midterm like test, traditional kind of thing, because we got a lot to do to finish our critical thinking application project this week. You're going to have to do 2 assignments to finish that up so we can hit our codes of ethics assignment next week, which is a requirement we got to get to, and then we'll have our final project to kind of finish this out. So this week is going to be definitely a week where we got to stay on top of things and keep at a solid pace to make sure that we're not getting behind and we're finishing this out strong. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and uh, we will talk about what this week looks like, and then much as I did in last week's video, I'm going to kind of show us through what we're doing. Then I want to kind of show some content, about the theories, and then I want to talk about the assignments a little bit. Okay. So pretty simple, similar kind of week. We're going to do our discussion post that's due by Tuesday, replies due by Thursday, and then come back Saturday and reply to people and myself who have responded to you. I mean, this is kind of like third time we're doing it, so I think we've all kind of got the hang of this by now. We're talking about non-consequential ethical theories this week. We'll get into what that is in a minute. You're going to want to do your chapter 6 and 7 quizzes before you get started on your assignment, so you have the knowledge background that you need to get going. And then we're going to apply Kant's deontology, as we did, opposite of what we did last week. Last week you applied act utilitarianism. So this week we're going to apply Kant's deontology. And then when we're done with that, we're going to have our 2 applications done. So you're going to make your final decision. So both of these are due this week. That's going to be a lot, unfortunately, but you could, if you stay with it, it'll be fine, because it'll be kind of downhill from here. So what you're going to do, in this, oops, sorry, didn't want to go there just yet. We're going to talk about Kant's deontology first. Okay. So come to the assignment for Kant's deontology, read over what the expectations are. You're going to basically, this is, I know a lot, but you're going to review the case study we've been working on. You're going to apply universality. You're going to apply respect for persons. And then in the conclusion paragraph, you're going to explain your decision, much like you did last week with the act utilitarianism thing. I want you to spend some time reading over these instructions, get used to them, get familiar with them, and then I'll show you an example here in a minute, and so it'll kind of make more sense for you. Make sure you do your submission checklist, and then you upload your document here, okay? But again, just put a pin in this real quick, because I'll work it through and show you. Make sure you download this document and use it. A lot of people didn't download the previous couple. Just make sure you do that, because it's going to keep it nice and formatted for you. I've got the wording that I want you to use in here. It's kind of specific, so if you just keep that with there, it'll be helpful for you, right? And so you can download that, fill it in. It's got the rubric attached to it, which is part of the assignment, right? Then when you're done with that, we're going to do the last 3 steps of the critical thinking model, which is decision making, evaluation, reflection. And so what this is going to ask you to do is it's going to ask you to take everything you've done previously and then put it all together. So you applied act utilitarianism and you got a decision, and you applied Kant's deontology and you got a decision. And technically both of these are good decisions because they were made through ethical theories, but realistically you can only do like one thing, right? So you're going to pick the thing that you would do and you're going to state that here. So where we were saying it should, like, should Bob do such and such, now we're going to say Bob should, right? We're going to make the statement of what they should do. So we're going to say what they should do, and then in a paragraph of about 150 words, benchmark. Benchmark means you're shooting for that. We're not really going over. I mean, my threshold here is like plus or minus 10%. It's not about going on and on and on. It's about concisely saying, this is why it's a good decision. You should be using stuff from the textbook to justify that. You should be citing it and documenting it in proper APA formatting. You're going to be paraphrasing when you do that from the textbook, no direct quotes. But we want to see how you've come to this decision at the end of the process. Then you're going to evaluate that decision against 3 possible objections. This means you're going to think of things that people can say against your decision as an argument, kind of like what I've been doing with you guys on the discussion boards, right? Whether I really believe that myself isn't relevant. Like, I read what you say, and like a lot of people, like in the shopping cart one, were like, what about the employees? So I would ask, okay, well, why are you putting the responsibility on the customer more so the employee? It's not because I'm like a rude customer. I'm a put the cart back kind of guy myself, you know. But the idea is I just want to see like if somebody were to ask you that, what would you say, right? And so that's kind of what we're doing here. We're preparing ourselves to defend our decision on this case about what Renee should do with her voting. If somebody says, well, she should do this, or, you know, that's not good because this, you know, so like, how would we defend it? So I'm not going to really work through this because it's kind of straightforward, but I also want to leave it to where I'm not influencing it because I want to see what you guys come up with, right? So what you'll do, I'll show you the assignment, you know, the example, right? But I want you to fill it in yourself. So you're going to come up with an objection, right? And then you're going to have a counter argument to it. So like whatever you pick with Renee should do blah, 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 blah. Somebody says, well, actually, this is the best, you know, option. And then, you know, you'll go for it. And so I'll kind of reiterate that in a minute when we talk about our guy, Bob, and his wife again. But like, hopefully this is making sense, right? So you'll do the objection and then your counter argument, which will be 3 to 4 sentences that you would say to defend your position. And then you're going to reflect in 150 words about the process, not the case, about the process, the energy and effort you put in, what you took from it, if you would use this kind of thing again, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure you follow your assignment checklist and you upload it. So you'll see here, again, there's another example. So what you'll do is you'll download this. You'll say what your decision maker should do. You'll write your paragraph, right? And then you see right here where it's just you list an objection against your final decision, and then you write your counter argument. So what would somebody say against your decision? And then what would you say to defend your position? What would somebody say against your decision? What would you say to defend your position? One last time, what would somebody say against your decision? And then what would you say to defend your position, right? And then you write your reflection in that 150 word benchmark paragraph about the process itself, okay? And then again, you got your references for the textbook because you should use some sites in there. And then you've got your rubric attached to the back, okay? So then that gets us to basically the last thing in the chapter, which is another quiz. And so you've got 3 quizzes this week, a discussion post, and the 2 assignments. And I know that's a lot, but again, this is kind of like in lieu of a midterm test. We're just going to have to jam up this week and get caught up on this project, because this is a project that usually in a face-to-face class we're going to do, and you know, in like the 16 weeks we're going to do over a month, like 1 each week. And unfortunately, we just don't have the luxury of time to do that because that would be the majority of our semester. But I did want to keep it at a slower pace in the beginning, the first couple weeks, compared to like what we're at now. So this way we like build up to this instead of like just start on like mayhem. Okay. So what I want to do, speaking of, I want to talk about some of the stuff from the chapter, kind of help put this together for you guys real quick. I'll do a quick rundown. I won't take too long, hopefully, explaining all 5 of these theories, but I want to give the gist of what's going on. So this week we're doing non-consequential ethical theories. And like we talked about last week, a consequential ethical theory is one in which the outcome dictated whether or not we did good or bad. Outcome good, we did good. Outcome bad, we did bad, period. In non-consequential ethical theories, it's the opposite. It's not the outcome that dictates our good or bad so much as it's the actions or even like the intent of what we did. Okay, that really it determines whether or not we did good or bad. Because if you think about it, we can't always predict the outcome. What we can control is ourselves. Okay, so non-consequential ethical theories, basically, these are the ones that base morality on actions rather than outcomes. So then, how do we evaluate those actions? We think about something called intent, our intentions, right? Good intent and malintent. Mal is bad. That's like that Latin bad, right? So you'll hear these phrases a lot: good intent, malintent in our world of ethics. So one of the things that could be good intent would be like goodwill, just doing good for the sake of doing good. And malintent would be things like lying and cheating, because we know these are bad, like regardless, right? Because the intent is to deceive, right? So, when we talk about Western philosophical ethics, we kind of start with the Stoics, the old Greeks. We got Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, etc. Socrates was worried about the written word, and it's kind of funny. We only know what he said because, like, Plato wrote it down, and he said, like, he was worried about writing things down because it'd make you lazy, and then knowledge could be abused. But because one of his students like broke his rule, here we are. We have their knowledge, right? So we're talking about Athens, Greece, about 400 years ago. The focus here is on character, being the right kind of person. It's an agent-centered theory, searching for the good life. Philosophy. I put this in here for one of my best friends who I was a student with at SBC. He's Greek. He loves everything, Greek words and roots and all that. And philosophy actually comes from like, philo knowledge and like or love, and like osophy, like knowledge. So like it kind of breaks down to like love of knowledge, right? And so in virtue ethics, we have Aristotle. So we're really looking at the Aristotelian virtue ethics in our class. I like this quote from Aristotle. He said, criticism is something we can avoid easily by saying nothing, doing nothing, and being nothing. Um, we have moral virtues, which you'll read about in the textbook, and these are the things that you know. This is how we can conduct the normal affairs of life, right? Our day-to-day virtues, self-control, courage, gentleness, witness, etc. But sometimes we need more than these basic virtues. So then we have our intellectual virtues. And these are the tougher ones. These are the ones that reflect what is unique about human nature, like namely our reason and rationale. So this is calmness, contemplation, reflection, wisdom, knowledge, etc., like that, because the virtues are important in this theory. There's something called teleology. Every kind of thing exists to do something unique and specific. So trees don't just sit there, they make oxygen, right? A thing fulfills its purpose, it's good. Everything in nature has a purpose. Humans are part of nature. Therefore, humans have a purpose. This is what Aristotle tells us, right? And so what is our purpose as human beings? What's the thing that we should be trying to achieve? It's talking about our nature. It's that thing that makes us unique. Dogs, trees, people, they all have sets of intrinsic qualities. We said a thing is good when it fulfills its nature. Ethics is based on purpose, purpose based on nature. So a lot of this back and forth about nature, purpose, etc. And so one part of human nature is reason. Human beings reason on a level unique among all creatures. So we reason ways in which that other animals, to our knowledge, don't. So that's part of our nature. So Aristotle says that humans are only are the only things, creatures, beings, whatever, capable of rational reflection, and therefore that's part of our nature. I talk about rational reflection. It's kind of interesting. So it's like I always use this metaphor in class. It's like we're in the grocery store, and we're the only species that'll stand there and look at a piece of chicken and look at a piece of tofu, and think about the ethical implications of eating either. And I'm not saying it's good or bad to eat one or the other, but I'm saying the fact that we think about it, shows our rational reflection. You don't see that in the animal kingdom. A lion will pounce on the last, childbearing gazelle on the Serengeti because it's dinner time. It's not thinking about sustainability. It's thinking, I'm hungry and there's a gazelle, I'm going to eat it. What he says is because we can rationally reflect that we should, because it's part of our nature. There's another thing, eudaimonia. Okay, that's another key concept of the theory, and that's happiness and flourishing. That's what they're going for with that good life. They want happiness and flourishing, and that's being well and living well are the other part of human nature. So reason and being well and living well, reason and eudaimonia, right? Intrinsically unique to humans, so that's what makes our nature. So then, what is human nature? Being well and living well through rational reflection. How do you know you're living the good life? You rationally reflect on your life, the decisions that you're making, the things that you're doing. If we weren't capable of rational reflection, we would never know if we were doing the good life or not. Okay? So reason, virtue, flourishing, it's this all continuing cycle to them about what makes us this virtuous being. Okay? Now, Aristotle gives us something to use as a test, if you will, as a guidelines for our actions, and that's the golden mean. And again, for my Greek friend, I'm gonna butcher the enunciation. If there's any Greeks on the watching the video here, I apologize. But pon metron ariston, right? Everything in moderation. That's their whole deal. It's the whole thing about like some wine good, too much wine's bad, right? So we want to learn how to use moderation, how to use self-control, and live in this balance between this balance of extremes. So virtues are balanced in moderation between points of extremes. And so this is our golden mean. Think about a balance beam where we have our desired virtue is in the middle. I heard somebody at an ethics competition once say, if you think about it, the golden mean, it's really like a dartboard, and we're trying to hit that perfect bullseye middle every time. We want to throw the dart and boom, land right in the middle. So we have our desired virtue right here in the middle, and we're living between these balance of extreme deficit and extreme excess. Okay. Now, this isn't going to make a ton of sense here, so I'll tell you what this means. This is something that comes over from my face-to-face class when we start talking about the consequential theories, but it works a lot better when there's a crowd in a discussion. But I tell a story about going to Chipotle, wanting to get guacamoles. There's 2 guacamoles left. There's some people in line. I take the last 2 guacamoles. Then we start talking about, have I done the right thing or the wrong thing? And so, like, an act utilitarian would say, don't take any of the guacamoles. And, actually, I think I might have mentioned this in last week's slides, right? So, yeah, maybe you know where we're at, right? So, we said that act utilitarians would take no guacamoles. Rule utilitarians would take 1 guacamole, leave 1 for somebody else. And then an egoist would take both guacamoles because they're just thinking about their best long-term self-happiness. And so it's this kind of extreme, right? So here we are again on this golden mean. If we put the guacamoles on the golden mean, we have our options: 2 guacs, 1 guac, no guac. So what do these represent in the terms of virtue ethics? Well, it's a food item. Obviously, I'm a big guy. You can probably see through your screen, right? So what's the virtue I would need to have here in this situation? Well, maybe self-control, right? So self-control is 1 guacamole, because at the end of the day, guacamole is good. It's not bad for you, right? And you should have a little bit of something that makes you happy and that you enjoy, but there's danger to having too much, because that's self-indulgent, right? And we're having more than we need. And then we have self-denial where we're not taking anything at all. And that's problematic as well, because we are allowed to have some happiness and pleasure and enjoyment. So we take 1 guacamole, right? That's the golden mean, the balance of moderation between extremes, right? So if you want to do this for your extra credit assignment, you apply virtue ethics, you state the central ethical issue. We've done that. You list your possible options. We've already done that, right? So now you determine the virtues called for by the situation, consider the options in terms of the virtues, evaluate the options using the golden mean, choose the option that is most consistent with the virtues and the golden mean. So choose the option that best finds a balance of moderation between opposing extremes in the situation when examined through the virtues. Okay. Then the next one we have, you'll see, is natural law. If there's any Catholics watching the video, you might know St. Thomas Aquinas as somebody other than a guy who has a high school named after him in Miami that wins state championships in football or whatever, right? He's one of the early founders of what we like the modern version of the Catholic Church. I like this quote by him: "The greatest kindness one can render to any person consists in leading them from error to truth." I updated it, said man, but back then, man was everything, but whatever. Want to be a little more inclusive, so I think that's why the brackets. But I think it's a good quote, right? Key concepts in natural law is good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided, right? If you're not religious, this may or may not ring to you. If you are, it probably will. This is the idea. It's very simple, very basic. We're supposed to do good and avoid evil. Okay. Where does this law come from? Well, he says God built it into humans. However evil a person is, there still exists a desire to do good, even if they can't find a way to get there, because the very existence of this law makes human moral development possible. Now, this is an interesting concept because why do we try to be good more so than bad if there isn't something within us that is driving us to be good? Why do we try to follow the rules? Why do we try to be good people rather than just give in to the base desire and do whatever we want? There's something compelling us to do that, is what Aquinas is saying. And he's saying it's this natural law that God's placed inside of us, that we're aware of, that we know about, and that is that internal kind of conscious. His whole thing centers around God being the ultimate authority figure to punish, because in one of his essays he wrote something, I'm paraphrasing loosely, but he was musing over the idea of, if you break a law and there's no authority figure there to impose a punishment on it, did you really do something bad? Well, his thing is God is the ultimate authority figure who will always be able to punish you whether you got away with something or not, and therefore we should be driving to do good whether we're going to get caught or not, but because it's what we're compelled to do. Now, he brings up the universal human goods, and it's these 6 things that he says everywhere you go, people would want these same 6 things. One is human life, health, procreation and reproduction, caring for our children, knowledge and the avoidance of ignorance, and human relationships and the consideration of other people's interests. And he might be onto something here. I think it'll be hard to find somebody who doesn't think these are good things. So his whole point is these are the things that people want and should be protected. So how do we know how to act? Actions that promote human goods are good, and actions that violate human goods are evil. Not just bad, evil. Now, this is where it gets kind of scary for people, because I had students in an ethics competition a couple of years ago, and they were using natural law, and they said, yeah, it's evil. And they're like, someone's like, well, I don't think it's evil. And it's a very loaded word. But the idea is, if you're following Aquinas's theory, yes, you think it is evil to violate that. So I told him you could just kind of say the word bad or wrong without shocking people. But this is his whole thing, is these forces of good and evil are at play with us. And if we promote human goods, we're good. If we're not promoting, if we're violating human goods, that's bad. We're evil in that actions, and we should avoid that. Okay. So if these values are shared by all, they must be part of human nature, right? Our purpose is to fulfill our human nature. Wait a minute. The foundation of ethics is to fulfill our purpose. This is sounding kind of familiar, right? Who does this sound like? Clicking in the wrong direction. Aristotle. Okay. So he was studying Aristotle and the Stoics and virtue ethics when he was coming up with his theory. Because remember, like Catholic Church was new, they had the Bible, they had the rules there, but he's like, I'm trying to think of like a more day to day, you got your 10 Commandments or whatever, but like how do we tell people how to live day to day, give them some guidance to live by? And here he sees the virtue ethics, and he's like, hey, this actually blends pretty well with my thing. And so he borrowed heavily from Aristotle and his peeps. So if you wanted to apply natural law for the extra credit assignment, you kind of see the pattern that is similar of how we do things. You state the central ethical issue, you list the possible options. Now you evaluate each option to see if it violates or interferes with the universal human goods. You eliminate all options that violate one or more of the human goods. So if any one of the human goods would be violated, we don't like it. And then any options remaining are morally permissible. Permissible means allowed. We can do that, right? And so it's all about those universal human goods. If one of your options violates one of those, we don't like it, we get rid of it, we move on to the next thing. Okay? Then we have natural rights. This is our guy, John Locke. We've already seen him a few times and we'll continue to see him. He's very influential. Comes up, I think he talks about in the moral development chapter, they talk about tabula rasa and all that, and John Locke. In the human rights, he comes up because not only is his natural rights theory basically like if we had an American ethic that we were based on, it would be natural rights. They borrowed very heavily from him, the framers of our Constitution and country, etc. But also the universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN created was borrowed, like steeped heavily in John Locke's natural rights theory, because he's the only one that really talks about rights. People talk about happiness, people talk about duty, and people talk about intent. He's really the guy who's talking about, like, what is your right? What are you owed simply by the fact that you were born a human being? Okay. And so his quote here that I like: all mankind being equal and independent, no one ought harm one another in their life, liberty, like life, health, liberty, or possessions. Sorry, John Locke. You'll typically hear life, liberty, property from him. Those were his three tendencies of the things that all humans, should get. And so he said, God gave us rights, and that's part of what makes us human. These rights pre-exist government. Governments exist solely to protect these rights, because if the rights are older than the governments, then the governments can't supersede those rights. What is our duty? We have a duty not to violate anyone's rights. And society comes second to the individual. Individual rights are important. So this is a stark contrast as well to the collective idea of, utilitarianism. There's more collectivism, like, hey, the good of the group, what creates a greater good for most people. Well, a guy like John Locke's going to say, hey, that's all great and all, but we don't step on an individual's rights to make the group happy. And that's kind of how America is, right? This is why when you remind people that we're a constitutional republic, this is why we're not a straight democracy. If we're a straight democracy, a lot of people are going to lose rights, because if 51% of the country says we don't want you to have it, you can't. Where's the fail-safe? Well, our fail-safe is our Constitution says, well, no, like, you can't deny that thing just because you don't like it. Now, I know we see people trying that, here and there, and that's what the Supreme Court's for. And we hope and trust that they're going to make an appropriate ruling with the, Constitution in mind. But that's the whole idea, is you can't say, well, I'm not allowed to have something, just because the group doesn't like it. I mean, who am I harming, right? So, life, liberty, and property. These are his three big things. This is the three things that everybody should have a right to, because they're human rights and we're born with those human rights. Now, he says we have two types of rights: positive rights, and that's something you're entitled to, but somebody owes you. And then we have negative rights, and that's no one else is required to provide it to you. They just have to stay out of your way. So a good example is, like, you have a positive right to a K through 12 education. You have this right because your individual state, if you're in Florida, it would be Florida, but your individual state has promised that to you, has codified that to you in the state constitution and said, we will give you a free and adequate education K through 12. All you have to do is show up and get it. In fact, it's to the point we know it's a positive right because if the state doesn't give you that education, you can actually hold them accountable. Keeping with that metaphor, though, college is negative right. Nobody owes you college as of yet. Nobody's promised you, a free college education provided by the state. So therefore, it's a negative right. It's something you can do as long as you meet the requirements and you can pay the money. But people just have to stay out of your way while you're doing it. They just can't block you from doing it. Does that make sense? So like one, you're owed. Think about a positive right as something that's been promised to you either by God or like an agreement, like a constitution. And it's one of those things where if somebody doesn't give it to you, they owe it to you. You can take action. Negative rights are things you have to get yourself. Locke's going to say that most of our rights are negative rights. I mean, because like you have a right to get married to whomever you want, but like the government doesn't owe you that spouse. So that's not a positive right, it's a negative right. Even our property rights, we have negative property rights in the United States. If property rights were a positive right, you would be born onto a deed, right? You would be born and land would be allotted to you. That's not the case. You can go out and buy land. People can't stand in your way of buying land, right? But it's not owed to you by the government. Because if it was a positive right, if the government didn't give you land, you could take action, right? So one of the things that you see is this equal liberties principles, and here's kind of a joke, the libertarian ideal, because this is where libertarianism comes from, by the way, at least the classical sense of it. So when you hear people talk about I'm a libertarian, depending what version they are, in the Lockean sense, this is the base of it. And so I found this thing here. It's like I want gay married couples to protect their marijuana plant with guns they bought with bitcoins, right? And so the idea is everyone is entitled to as many rights and liberties as possible, as long as rights and liberties are not being taken from others. So people have the basic freedom to do whatever they want. It's our duty to extend these same rights and freedoms to others. And see, this is the kind of thing we get caught up on sometimes. Like, I say it's a class and it's not to, be a gun nut or like get people like freaked out, but it's like I can own 100 AR-15s. Until I use one to take your life, liberty, or property, it's not a problem. You can marry whoever you want, and it's not a problem until you prevent me from marrying who I want. You see, this is what the idea is. I'm going to live my life, and you're going to live your life, and we're just not going to take rights and opportunities away from each other. A pretty common sense ideal, if you ask me, but there's a lot of people that they think that it's their goal in life to wake up every morning and try to remove a right from somebody, even though them exercising that right doesn't even really affect them, right? So that's the gist of the equal liberties principle. So in the Lockean spirit, because these are in your textbook chapter, he never really actually said these things, but if you break down what he's talking about, you have these 6 categories, and these are the 6 categories that make the 12 planks of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. Security rights, due process rights, liberty rights, political rights, equality rights, and welfare rights. So what this means basically is protection from murder, injury, torture, protection from harsh punishment, protect your beliefs and your movement, like your freedom of movement to go around and travel, participate in politics, vote, hold office. That's supposed to say vote. I don't know if way is, right? You got equality before the law, and you provide with education, protection from poverty and starvation. Okay. Now, when you apply natural rights, you state your central ethical issue, list your possible options, identify relevant positive and negative rights of the stakeholder in each situation, eliminate options that actively violate anyone's positive or negative rights, and then select an option that does not violate any rights. Then we have consteontology. This is probably what you're excited for. This is what this week's assignment is. Our man Kant says morality is not properly the doctrine of how we may make ourselves happy, but how we make ourselves worthy of happiness. He said that happiness alone isn't a good way to gauge, our moral behavior, like in utilitarianism, because it's a fleeting emotion. We should have some hard, fast rules. So his thing is deontological. Deon meaning duty, and duty meaning there's some behaviors are right or wrong, just period, right? And so goodwill, this is do the right thing for its own sake. This isn't where we do something good because we're expecting like a reciprocity. You know what I mean? But it's just we did good because it needed to be done. And then autonomy is another big thing of this theory. Auto, meaning self, nomi coming from nomos, which means law. So autonomy literally means self-law, self-regulation. Okay. And so he has the categorical imperative, and this is what we're going to use this week to test our decisions that our decision maker is trying to make to resolve the issue in our case. So it's a two-part thing. One's universality, and we're going to act only in the maxim which you can at the same time will to be universal law. And that maxim is unconditional general rule. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying, would you want people to do this thing every time, always, even if it happened to you? You want to think of universality in a black and white coin flip. We're going to either do the thing or not do the thing. And so if my only options is we do it every time or we do it never, what would we want to do? And so, like, good example from one of our ethics bowl things a couple years ago, we're going against UCF. We're kind of similar on a case. They were trying to make their point. They were making a bad argument. My people didn't really catch it, but I was trying to tell them afterwards how we could have got them because they were kind of misunderstanding Kant's theory because we were talking about banning books. Now, universally, would I want all people in all situations to ban books? No, of course not. Because we can't live in a world without books, because what do books represent? Transmission of information. So what we're really saying when we're talking about banning books is like, do I want to stop the transmission of information or not? Well, no, of course we want information. So universally, we like books. And that's what they were saying. Okay? But they were forgetting the second part, respect for persons. And this is act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as the end and never the means only. So an end is a goal and a means is a tool. This means we treat people as a goal, not as a tool. We can't use people for our own gain if they're not getting a mutual benefit. So the idea here is like if I have a truck and you need a truck and I need 10 grand and you've got the 10 grand and we make an exchange, I'm using you for the 10 grand, you're using me for the truck, but we're both benefiting, so it's okay. Nobody's being exploited here. The exploitation arises where I sell you the truck knowing it's a lemon, it breaks the next day, and I have your money and you don't have the truck. Or, you give me the check and it bounces. You've got my truck, I can't find you anymore, and I don't have your money. See, there's an unequal benefit. Respect for persons is wild too, because some people have a hard time reconciling the fact that you can't do anything against yourself just to make other people happy. So this is anybody being exploited, including yourself. This is why this is kind of the exact opposite of act utilitarianism. This is why we put these two together. Like, again, not because they're the best, but because they're the most different, right? In act utilitarianism, if I'm the decision maker, I have to act in a way in which creates the greatest amount of good for the most amount of people possible, even if it comes at the expense of myself. In Kant's theory, I can't do that. I have to have a mutual benefit. I can't make people happy by exploiting myself. I can't make myself happy by exploiting myself, which sounds kind of crazy, but like, Dave Monroe used a good example in a video once. Like if you use heroin, that's exploitation, right? Because some people say, well, I'm doing it to myself. What's the problem? The problem is to get the happiness, the pleasure of the high, you have to damage your body and you could potentially die from taking the drugs. So you're exploiting your body to get to happiness, your life, if you will, to get to happiness. So we don't like that. So it gets a little tricky for people, but you have to think if anybody anywhere can be exploited, not just the stakeholders you listed on your chart, if that decision exploits anyone anywhere, we don't like it. Okay. So I've got a little flow chart on here to kind of help you think about. It's a two-step process. And, we're asking two questions and we're looking for a yes and a no in a sense, right? So you're about to make a decision. You stop and you ask yourself, is this something I would want everyone to do every time, period, point blank, even if it happens to me? Well, if immediately you say no, we know that's a bad option. It's a bad decision. Now, is this something I want done every time? Yes. Now our second question is anybody being exploited? If we get a yes, then that's a bad decision. Okay? If we get a no, then this is a good decision. So we're looking for a yes and a no. Yes, this is universal. No, no one's being exploited. So let's go back to this book ban thing. They were saying we will never ban books universally. Can't ban them. And I was telling my students if I were a judge in this competition or a competitor at the table, I just would have asked them, so you've never heard of child pornography? And they're like, what? I'm like, so you're saying that that's okay, or Holocaust denial is okay to have published in books and out on the shelves for people to grab? And then they'd be shocked. And I'd be like, so yes, universally, the idea of books is good. But on a case by case scenario, we can find instances where a book exploits somebody. And so, therefore, in that case, we don't like it. This is where it gets confusing for people because they could say, well, if something's universal, how can it exploit? It's like, because on the idea, if our only case was yes or no, on the idea of it, yes, we like it. But in this particular case, we don't like it. There's exploitation. Is selling somebody a truck universally good? Sure, because we can't live in a world where we don't have vehicles and we don't have access to vehicles, right? I mean, technically we could, but you know what I mean, right? But in this case, it was exploitation because I knew that the truck that I sold you wasn't good. Does that make sense? And so that's what we're looking for. Now, there's some perfect duties that are going to automatically make sure things aren't universal. Kant talks about certain things like you can't lie, you can't cheat, you can't steal, you can't harm, like, period, because there's no way to universalize those because they're all steeped in malintent. This is something that's brought a lot of criticism to Kant, because somebody wrote a paper, an essay once that said, okay, so Kant's saying when the German SS comes to your house and asks you if you're harboring a Jewish family and you're addict, you have to say yes, and then they'll take them off and bring them to the camps and whatever, right? And that's why his theory is bad. And it's like, I don't know if it's meant to be that extreme. I mean, I don't think Kant's saying that, deontologists never lie. We're not perfect. It's just that when we lie, we know that we're doing something bad. The general reason why we don't like lying is because it's hard to universalize. Because what I always tell my students is, use this phrase: could we live in a world where blank? Right? So can we live in a world where we knew everybody was lying? No. Because you would know right now that I'm not telling you the truth. Does that make sense? So it's like, to universalize it, you're saying that the opposite of it's immoral. So if you want to test your universality, just ask yourself, so if I said, banning books, is universal, that means, having a book was immoral. That's crazy, right? So if I say lying is universal, that means telling the truth is immoral. Well, we know it's the opposite, right? So that's what you're looking at for this, okay? And then I'll show you my work through of it in a little bit, and it'll make more sense, hopefully. So when you apply it, you state the ethical issue, you list your options, you apply universality and eliminate all options that could not be moral standards for everyone. This is important. You only apply respect persons to the options that were universal. So then you apply respect for persons and you eliminate all options that exploit anyone, and then you can choose any of the remaining options. We'll get to that in a second. Lastly, we talk about contractarianism. These are the rules of conduct, the social contracts. Some of you may have read me using the word social contract in like my responses to your discussion posts. That's that written and unwritten like rules that we follow in society, like putting your shopping cart back. We know that to be an unwritten rule of the social contract because everybody's aware that that's that expectation, and they know that if they don't put their cart back, there is going to be some level of rejection to that idea. And so that's kind of like the whole idea between the social contract. You may have heard me say at some point, like, make an argument that's hard to reasonably reject. That comes from T.S. Scanlon in his book, What We Owe Each Other, which you might have seen if you've seen The Good Place. And he says what we owe each other is to act towards one another in a way in which it would be difficult to reasonably reject. Because you can rationally reject a lot of things, but like reasonably rejecting it is a lot better. Like I don't have to put my shopping cart away because it's not mine. That's a rational rejection. But the reasonable rejection would be like, well, yeah, but come on, man. Like, you're making somebody's job a little bit easier. It's a courtesy to everybody else, and it's just right there. That's harder to overturn than the just I don't have to, right? And so our social contract theory that we're going to be looking at is from John Rawls. And look, we get like a color picture finally. We're like in modern times. And he says that a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'd be willing to enter it in a random place. We know that there's no such societies because, especially in America, like certain individuals wouldn't want to go back to any part of American history and expect to have an equal life, So the social contract says a fair society would be the result of a fair social contract. Members would understand true fairness and incorporate the values into communal life. The economic, legal, political, educational systems would all be fair. If the social contract isn't fair, society can't be fair either. There are no actual societies that use this model. It's not about literal perfection, but kind of trying to be perfect, I like to bring up this because it's a lot about the difference between equality and equity. This is equality, everybody getting the same thing. My friend who's a lawyer always says, yeah, but why are they trying to steal a baseball game? And I'm like, you're taking the wrong thing here, bud. The idea is to make everybody equal. We give everybody an apple crate to stand on to look over the fence and see the game. This guy clearly doesn't need one. This is just enough. And then this poor little kid can't even see through the crack, right? So equity, making sure that people have the same outcomes, would be like this. So this guy who doesn't need an apple crate gives the apple crate to the kid who needs two, and then this kid still has his one crate. And now, instead of the inequality of some people not being able to see, we have the equity of everybody getting to the same outcome. So the original position is we start with an imaginary meeting where the social contract's discussed. It's this hypothetical imaginary situation where participants in the contract deliberate the rules of conduct. This meeting would include everyone, past, present, future, who would live under the contract. And whatever the participants agree on would be the social contract. So this is like, imagine everybody that's ever going to live in this country goes to Raymond James stadiums and they hash out the rules. Whatever they come up with would be the social contract. Again, it's hypothetical, but the idea would be we should be thinking about what's the equitable way to live through in our society. While we're doing this, we're going to be considering the primary goods. So there's four of them. There's rights and liberties, power and opportunity, income and wealth, and then self-respect. Now, he says the most important is self-respect, because what does it matter if you get all these things, but you can't look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day? The important tool that he gives us is the veil of ignorance. Now, I say, the idea of America was pretty good in the beginning, that all men are created equal, but the execution of it was all rich, white, landowning men were equal, because the founders of the Constitution were missing the veil of ignorance. And this would have, I think, been a good thing to help them out. When we're in the original position, we put a blinder on ourselves to all the individual things that make us who we are. So, like me, white, Christian, male, husband, son, etc., professor. I take all these categories that make me me, I put them behind me, I make myself blind to them. And then when I'm making rules that everybody would follow, I'm making a rule that doesn't disproportionately benefit me in one of my categories that it doesn't benefit somebody else in. That's the veil of ignorance. So there's 3 principles of justice. 1 was the equal liberties. We had talked about that. 2 is the equal opportunities, which is equal rights for all. And 3 is the difference principle. And the difference principle is the big one. When all things are equal, we make a decision that would benefit the historically least advantaged in society. So that makes sense, right? This is kind of the whole thing where affirmative action came up originally. If you have a white applicant and a black applicant, and on paper they're identical. Well, then historically, if this is a space where black males hadn't been able to get a lot of employment, you would throw it to the black male side because, historically he's not been advantaged and the other guy has. Obviously, this is a sensitive topic for a lot of people. This has been going on right now and even went to the Supreme Court recently with the Harvard, lawsuit, because the idea is when it becomes unequal, when the 2 people are unequal and then you still favor one over the other, now you're getting outside of the difference principle. It's supposed to be they're exactly the same resume. The difference is one is an African American who hasn't traditionally been able to be, like, let's say, a police officer in Chicago at the time, right? So you would give them the job versus the white guy who historically that's all they've had for cops, right? Does it make sense? So when you're applying it, you state the central ethical issue, list your possible options, and then you choose the option that would seem most fair to the interest of primary goods of all stakeholders. And then, if there are no ideally fair options, choose the one that best protects the interests of the least advantaged stakeholders. Okay? And that's I know this one's going to be a little bit longer, but those are our theory breakdown, the quick and dirty, if you will, for this particular thing. So now I just want to show you real quick applying Constantology, what you're doing in this week's assignment. We're going to list our options. We're going to test each option for universality. We're going to test only the options that pass universality for respect for persons. And we're going to choose any options that pass universality and respect for persons. So let's go back to our guy, Bob. We're going to write these out in full sentences because remember, intent matters. And I need all the verbs and words to know what the intent is. So our 4 options to remind you are: Bob could do nothing about his wife's cheating. Bob could divorce his wife. Bob could ask his wife to join him for marriage counseling. And Bob could separate from his wife. So now we test these in universality. Now, use the wording that I've provided on the document for you. Fill it in the best you can. Can you explain it in your own words? Sure. But I don't want you guys to drift too far from it. We're testing the underlying moral action as if this is something we want to do all the time. We are wide in universality and we get narrow in respect for persons. The big advice I want to give you is don't fall into the trap that students usually do where they try to solve the whole thing in universality. They look ahead and they think, oh, I know this option is not going to work, so it mustn't be universality. Remember, books, not banning books is universal. But on an individual level, we might have a good reason to ban a book. So universality is a test all of its own. Perfect world scenario. Black and white. We flip the coin. We're doing the thing or we're not doing the thing. Right? Which side comes up heads, if you will. Then you take it through respect for persons. So, like I told you last week, if you do the 4 options, most of you look like you did a good job with do the thing, don't do the thing, some sort of compromise, and like the wild card, right? Well, if you have 2 opposites, doing the thing or not doing the thing, one of those has to come up universal. If they're both not universal, you made a mistake. You know what I mean? If they're both universal, you made a mistake. One should be universal, the other should not, because remember that the direct opposite then would be immoral to do. So, Bob could do nothing about his wife's cheating. Would I want all people universally consistently to do nothing? No. And what's my rationale? Doing nothing is not a universal moral rule I would want everyone to follow in every situation. We have to do something. I'm doing something right now. If you're watching me, you're doing something. So we literally cannot live in a world where we do nothing, right? Does that make sense? That's how broad we're looking at this. 2, Bob could divorce his wife. Would I want all people universally consistently divorced? No. Rationale. Ending relationships is not a universal moral rule I would want everyone to follow in every situation. Now people are freaking out thinking, okay, but sometimes you need to get a divorce. Yes, sometimes you do. We'll talk about that. But if my options are we always get divorced or we never get divorced, I'm going to go with never get divorced. Does that make sense? Because just because there's a problem doesn't mean our knee-jerk reaction is to get divorced. That would mean anytime there was an issue in the marriage, if you didn't get divorced, you'd be acting immorally. But hold on to that thought. If you're kind of thinking, like I'm being some guy who's going to force a woman to stay in a bad marriage, I promise I'm not. All right. 3, Bob could ask his wife to go to marriage counseling with him. Would I want all people universally morally consistency to seek help? Seek help. See what's counseling? The underlying action here is seek help with their problems. Yes. Seeking help is a moral rule I would want everyone to follow in every situation. Bob could separate from his wife. Would I want all people universally consistently to avoid their problems? No, because that's what a separation would be, right? That would just be them walking away from the problem, but not necessarily working on it. So no, my rationale, avoiding problems is not a universal moral rule I would want everyone to follow in every situation. Now remember, I'm using my autonomy. I'm looking at this thing. I'm trying to think of what's good intent, what's the goodwill, what's universal, etc., etc. So that being the case, only one of mine passed universality. So now I have to look at it through respect for persons. Bob could ask his wife to go to marriage counseling with him. Is Bob exploiting anybody? Is he using anybody as a means to an end? No. So this is a good option. Now I've had people challenge me over the years. Oh, he's forcing his wife. Where did I say forcing? This is why the wording is important. A kid once asked me, isn't it just semantics? I'm like, yes, but semantics matter. Words matter. Action verbs convey different meanings. Nothing wrong with ask. Ask is fine. Bob could ask his wife to go to marriage counseling. She could say no, and that could be the end of it. He didn't stick a gun to her head and said, you got to go to marriage counseling with me, right? No exploitation. Maybe she goes, maybe they don't go, but this is something he's trying to do that's universal and doesn't exploit. Now, going back to the divorce thing, maybe they go to counseling, and through counseling, they decide that, yes, it is the best thing to get divorced. Then they'll get divorced. And you're like, but you said divorce wasn't universal. But we tried something else first, is what's important. Does that make sense? Before we went straight to that option, we tried something that was universal. We're going to get help. And then the help, we realize, you know what? This actually isn't salvageable. We're going to go on our way. The idea is we tried this thing in the meantime that better fit. Remember, Kant doesn't say you're not going to lie. He just says that you know that you shouldn't lie. So we tried to get help first, which was better than just pulling the plug. Hopefully that makes sense, right? So then when we write our decision, if Bob were Kantian, he would ask his wife to go to marriage counseling. Now, you might have more than one option, okay? That's okay. In act utilitarianism, there was only one best way to get to the greatest good, right? Kant's deontology, there's a lot of good reasons. There's a lot of ways to get to a good reason. We're just trying to eliminate the bad ones. Now, as it says in your assignment instructions, if you eliminate all your options, which I don't think anyone's really in danger of that from what I've seen, you don't force one to be right. You just come up with a fifth option that works. And then write it in your little paragraph and say, none of the options work. So if you know, none of them pass universality, respect for persons. So, you know, if Renee was truly a Kantian, she would do blah, 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 because it's universal. There's no exploitation, da, da, da. So you just act as if that option was always available and you present it in that decision. Okay. I'm sorry this video is a little bit long, but there's a lot in this week to cover. If you have any questions about the assignments as you're going, please feel free to reach out. Other than that, continue with your hard work. And once we get through the hump of this, I think it slows down a little bit. We do our code of ethics next week, and then we'll get ready for our final argument videos. And then, 2 weeks from now, we're basically thinking about being done, 2.5 weeks or so. So we're almost there. As I said, the pace would be like super fast, but if we can power through it, then we get there pretty quickly and get it behind us. So if you need anything while you're working the other week, please feel free to ask. If not, you guys have a great week 4, and I will see you next week for my video. Have a good one.